I want to deal with some of the points that Shunamit raised. Professor Magnus raised. I'm sorry, I was kind of raising my hand when you said Professor Stanford. I was looking to see if he was here. Then I realized you were talking about me. But since I'm going to talk a lot about hierarchy now, I'll just stay with the terms as well, or try to. In any case, I really want to thank Professor Magnus for the points she raised. I already read what you were going to say, and I was debating whether I should rewrite my paper in light of what you said, because you had so many good points and so many things I should have shifted, but I didn't. I'm going to stay kind of with what I had planned to say, but many of the things I said really should be sharpened or refined or unfortunately deleted in light of these comments, because these are not simple issues, and it's always worthwhile to rethink things that are said. What I want to stress in looking at Eastern Europe are some things that I personally think are useful. And one of them is to remember that the Jewish society, like every society, was really quite hierarchical. There was little talk about equality or even equal opportunity as a value. And on the other side, there was a great deal of influence and concern with issues of status. Men going to shul, this is not the women's section, were very clearly put in their place. Certain people sat in front, certain people sat in back, certain people were called up to the Torah, certain people were not called up to the Torah. It was a society which really was not easy. You cannot simply divide it like in our society. You cannot divide it between one pole, another pole, male and female, but it's male and female, it's rich and poor, it's educated and less formally educated. And this really makes it very complex looking at society. Many of the people, not Professor Magnus, but many of the others, have looked at Jewish society and have focused only on the elites and analyzed what was or was not among the elites, and the dynamics among the masses or the poor people were often quite different. I can give you a simple example, one which I found quite amusing at the time. There is a fair amount of literature to discuss patterns of Jewish marriage in Eastern Europe and describes early marriage as being typical for Jews. Now, early marriage is a subjective statement. That means I think it's early because I would not like or myself or my children to marry at the age. But here I'm not using it in a subjective sense, but objectively. In what sense? That boys, men, or young men and women, boys and girls, were often married before they were sexually mature, before menarche, and that is biologically early. Body's not ready for it. Now, the phenomena was discussed. There are all kinds of autobiographies. There are tragic stories involved with these marriages. But the thing which is significant is that even though all of the autobiographies from the period seemed to discuss it, it was only among the elite. Because after these early marriages, the young couple, he was 13 and she was 12, did not go off to their brand new house, but they lived in the house, usually at the house of the bride's family, until the couple reached the age of 18, 19, in which case they went off on their own. Most of the Jewish population, and that means in this case 90%, simply were poor. There was no way that they were going to get married as children, and they delayed their marriage until they were able to support themselves, until the man had usually learned a trade or a business, and the woman had learned something or had accumulated some a practical dowry. But most of the poor people got married at the age of 18 or 19. Now, there are pluses and minuses to poverty. We're most familiar with the minuses. But when people got married at the age of 12 and 13, it was almost always, I would say always, but somebody's going to pull out an example, almost always decisions made by parents, because parents had authority, because since the young couple was going to live on the account of the parents, there's no way they were going to be able to make independent decisions. Whereas the people who were poor and could only get married when they were ready to be somewhat independent, when the young tailor was finished with his journeyman's occupation, or the shoemaker, when they were able, on the cusp of independence, to get married, they were also able to pick their partner. And that's where you find a fair degree of choice and romance and selection. So, if you're poor, you have more freedom of choice, or had. If you were rich, you could enjoy a big dowry. The price was that your parents were going to pick the partner. So there's kind of a, I don't think it's a trade-off, it wasn't deliberate, but that's the way it worked. So that looking at autobiographies and saying, oh yes, Jews in the 18th century got married very early, is deceptive. It's certain kinds of Jews. And this is the problem that I think comes over and over, looking at those populations that were literate or that left a record as representative, and as opposed to looking at the total population. And this is also part of the problem of even looking at Jews. Professor Magnus mentioned, I have to argue with you a little bit, that Jews were no question persecuted in Europe, suffered from anti-Semitism, which happens to be absolutely true. However, with my odd way of looking at things, when I want to compare groups and I try to think of a measure which is objective or a pretend objective, what I look at is basically population growth and survival. Which population is able to bring more progeny to an age in which they can reproduce? If you look at the animal kingdom, and I may get to that, this is one of the main measures of dynamics, the desire of males to have progeny and the desires of females to have progeny. However, they work with different dynamics. Now, if we look at the Jewish population in Eastern Europe, consistently, from the very beginning of Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe, Jewish population grew faster than the population of non-Jews. And if the Jewish population grew faster, I take that to mean that their living conditions in one way or another were better. Now, if you would ask a normal observer of, say, 17th century Polish society, would it be better to be born a Jew or a non-Jew? People might give quick answers, but the best answer would be, well, what kind of a Pole? If you're talking about being a Polish noble, probably most people would have chosen to be born a Polish noble and not to be born a Jew. However, if the choice was to be a Jew or a peasant, where the death rate of infants sometimes got up to 50% in the first year, then I think that most people think, after a second thought, would say it's probably better to be a Jew than to be a peasant. Much as Jews are persecuted, peasants were persecuted in certain ways even more. So that all of these images and comparisons, we have to define, the population that we're looking at and what were the conditions. So if we take a look then at the Jewish family, I would like to say, and this fits, I think, with what Professor Letterhandler, outside I would say Ellie, would say. And I think that typically the Jewish family was a weak family as compared with other societies. In other words, parental authority was limited and independence of children, it's the other side of the coin, was relatively high. Why? I tend to see these things in economic terms because I think money is basically the bottom line. Early marriage with parental selection of partners, that's because parents have the money and the young couple will need it. That's why in Haredi society, early marriages arranged by parents are early marriages. When in Haredi society people marry late, and it does happen, then the parents have almost no role in the decision making. Money is the basis of power. Now, if we take a look at Jewish family, most Jews, the 90% who didn't get written down, they were poor, they were involved in trades, and if you take a trade such as a carpenter or a tailor or a shoemaker, the child learns the trade, and almost inevitably, the male child learns the trade, almost inevitably, when they reach a level of going off to be independent, they're going to have to consider going to another place, because the number of tradespeople needed in any given place is limited, and there's always a need to find a niche, and very often that niche is in a new community. So I think that almost built in Jewish society was a structure in which young people were expected to become relatively quickly independent, to pick their partners themselves, and to leave home and to go off somewhere else and to seek their fortune. Now, what about the image of the Jewish family and this great love between parents and children, the strong ties? There are images. And there are images of people, how they would have wished the past to have been, how they wished their own family was. But an image is an image, and you cannot translate it as having been the reality. So I think that this weak family structure was at the root of a lot of the ability of Jews to quickly adapt to new situations, as opposed to populations who came from farming communities where the parents had been farmers, and where in a farming community independence is a distant dream. A young man, and here I'm sorry, I just focus more on men than on women, but a young man whose father is a farmer is not planning to go out and buy land, because that's really difficult. His hope is that his father will pass on the land, and then he can move into the place of his father. And that gives parents a much greater power. The example I often bring is Prince Charles of England, who every morning gets up in the morning and say, well, did my mother die? Because he will never be king until she dies, and she keeps on living and living and living. So that in that kind of a society, you have terrific parental authority. If Charles could go off to Australia and become king of Australia, then he would have been a much more independent kind of a personality. So that we go back now to look at the Jewish community, the points that Professor Magnus made are really serious points. They're really, and I hope that she or I or both of us independently will rework it and point them out. But what the point that concerns me is that power structures are built in all creatures. In other words, if we look at all mammals, we see that in all mammals there are divisions of roles between males and females. And it doesn't matter what the particular division is, but they work differently. And I think the same way that if we talked about Jews, it would be correct but totally irrelevant to say, well, all Jews are mammals. The same way to say that in a society which most work was physical, whether it be farming or others, that it's not at all surprising that there are different economic roles. And whatever happens in society, it's the economic roles that are the basis for all the other, or almost all the other roles. If you think I sound a little Marxist, you know, with a kippah you can say anything. So that if we take a look at that pattern, I think that what we have today is a much better world to live in. I would not like to live in Jewish society 100 years ago. And I think that it's the economic structures of today that make it possible to achieve valuable goals that were inconceivable a generation ago. Because with so many skills today, it's not the male or female that counts, but it's the ability, and males and females have ability. So to look back at the Jewish society and to say that it is a society in which there were certain roles that were restricted to men, this is to be taken for granted. There was no society that was not patriarchal. So that's like Jews were mammals and Jews had different roles, and then it was not egalitarian. The thing which I like to emphasize is that I would want to avoid the term patriarchal, but if somebody wants to use it, then at least to say that it was patriarchal in a different way, and it was really, really complicated. Sometimes I think it's useful when coming to give a lecture to go to a complicated topic, show all the different factors, and then to give a very clear conclusion. My hope is that looking at least the structure of the Jewish family, it'll become totally unclear, very complex, and if we can make the clear not at all obvious, then I think we're moving in the right direction.